Hi guys, welcome to the second video in the D3 tutorial series. In this video, I'll be showing you how to make the scatter plot I showed you in the last video. Basically, I'll just be walking through the code used to create this plot. Alright, before we get started, the one thing you do need to install is VS Code. If you already have another development environment you prefer, feel free to use that. But I'll just be using VS Code in this tutorial. So if you just search VS Code download, you can find this page and download whichever version matches your operating system. So after you have that installed, VS Code has these things called extensions, which sort of, they're extensions for your development environment. And the one we need today is called Live Server, and it's basically a tool that lets you reload your web browser live. So instead of having to refresh it every time we make changes to our code, it does it automatically. So just click the Extensions tab here and search Live Server and go ahead and install that one. And a couple other nice ones I have. These aren't essential, but this one, JavaScript code snippets. It just has a few commands that you can type, which saves time for us. And also Excel viewer to view the CSV file we'll be using. So you can sort of view it in a table rather than a text file. Once you have VS Code and the extensions installed, the next thing we need to do is download the data. So the Iris dataset I found on this GitHub here. I'll link this in the description below. But once you have that installed, you can open it and let's take a look. So using the Excel viewer extension, you can see we have 4 columns with numerical data about the flower and also the variety of flower here. So once that's installed, we can get started with coding. So the 2 file types we'll need to create for a D3 visualization are the HTML file, which is the physical document where our visualization will be shown, and also the JavaScript file. This is where we'll be creating the actual visualization. So HTML and JavaScript knowledge would be nice for this tutorial to have, but it won't be necessary since I'll be going over each line and explaining what I'm doing at every step. So first, let's look at the basic skeleton of an HTML document. So this tag here, that's just saying the document type is HTML. And then this HTML tag here, that's just where the HTML code is contained. And then the 2 main parts of your HTML document are the head and body. So the head is where we'll have all the information that doesn't show up. So things like our JavaScript script and are things like the title of the page and other things like that. The body is where all the content that does show up is contained. So the actual visualization will be contained in the body. Okay, before we start coding, let's start our live server so we can view our output in real time as we're coding. So if you look down here, there's a button that says Go Live. So let's go ahead and click that, and we'll have a new tab open up. And you can see up here is the name of our HTML document. So if we inspect the page, you can see here's our HTML head tag and body. Right now nothing's showing up because we haven't added anything, but if we go ahead and type something in the body here, like a header, for example, iris plot, and we go back to our browser, we can see that it shows up. So that shows our server is working. And yeah, so first thing before we get started creating the plot, we do need to have D3 in our HTML document. So we can do that using a script tag, which basically includes another file, whether that's a local file or something from online in our HTML document. So on the D3 website, you can download the physical D3 files, but I think an easier way is just to copy this script tag here, and if we include that in our HTML document right here, we have access to D3. So we also do need to include our JavaScript file. So that's the same format as this one above. We type source, which tells us where to look, and we just type the name of our file. I called mine D3.js tut1 concepts, but just type whatever you named your JavaScript file. So yeah, that should be included. And one way we can test that, in JavaScript, if you type console.log, that's like the print in Python. Let's say hi. And then if we go back to our server and inspect, the shortcut for that on Windows is Control-Shift-I. And if we look at the console here, we see hi. So that shows that the script we included, it is connected to our HTML document. So that's good. So that means we can include our plot as well. So the container for D3 visualizations is usually an SVG tab. So we just type SVG and close the tag. And I'll give this an ID so it's easier to reference. So let's call it something like iris plot. All right, so the HTML document is all set. And now we can switch over to our JavaScript file and get started on that. So the first part of creating our visualization is including our data. So in D3, when you want to use a D3 command, you just type D3 and then dot. So since our file is a CSV, we just type d3.csv and then the file name, which is iris.csv. And then we can type .then, which tells us what we would then want to do with the data. So the CSV returns the data, and then the then takes that data, and then we can do something with it. So using our console.log command again, we can type console.log data just to make sure that the data is loaded successfully. So if we save again, go back to our browser, inspect, we can see all the data is in fact here. So that's good. If you're used to like data frames in Python, in JavaScript, data is actually stored in a different format. So you can see it's an array here. And then each element in the array it looks like a dictionary in Python. It's called an object in JavaScript. So you have the key and property. So yeah, the data format is a bit different in JavaScript, but it's still easy to work with. Yeah, so we do have the data loaded in. I like to assign the data to a more informative name. So let's call it like iris data in case, in the future you might be working with multiple data sets or something. So I just like to have it with a clear name here. So we've defined our data, redefined our data as iris data. And next, let's start creating the plot. So the first thing we want to do is select the SVG tag we created here. So in D3, the way you do that is D3.select. So we can select by class, the class of an object, or the ID. ID is more specific, and you can use it to select one element, which is what we want to do here. So we can just select iris plot. And the way you do an ID is the hashtag symbol. So hashtag iris plot. And let's assign that to a variable. We'll just call it SVG for now. And once we have this SVG, you have to define the actual width and height of it. So that you do that with .style. Let's define the width as, let's actually create some constants here, because we will be using that height and width in the future. So let's just say width like 500 pixels for now. And let's say the same thing for the height. And the way I copied that line down on Windows is just Shift-Alt down. So that's a nifty little shortcut. So let's create a height as well. And you define this width as our width constant, and also just add a pixel there. And then same thing with height. Okay, so we create our SVG and define the size. Before we go any further, let's check that it actually worked. So what we can do here, go back to the browser, click the Elements tab, and here you can see the SVG. It is in fact a square, 500 by 500. So that's the space we'll be working in. So that's good. Next, let's first outline the steps we'll be following. I like to use comments to sort of say what we're doing before we get started. So before we create the graph, we do need scales to work with. We'll need to create the axes using those scales. And we also, well, this isn't necessary, but it is nice to have labels. Otherwise, we wouldn't know what we were looking at. And lastly, we can plot the data. So these are the steps we'll be taking. First, I'm just gonna switch over to my Notes tab and explain what the scales and axes are. All right, let's pretend this white box here is our computer screen. And let's say the SVG box that we created to plot our data is something like this. So when we want to plot a data point in D3, we actually need to use the pixel values. So say like this point here would be like 300 by 300. But our data comes in its own units. So in our case, the data comes in as centimeters. So the reason we need a scale is, let's say we have a flower that's 3 centimeters by 3 centimeters, and we would need to convert it to whatever the amount is in pixels in order to plot it onto our SVG. So the simplest scale is D3.scale linear. So this one, a linear scale, what it does is it takes the minimum value. So let's say, for example, it would be 2, just to throw a number out there, and 6 centimeters. And our range, let's say for the x-axis, is 0 to 500. What it does is it projects the 2 to the 0, sorry about that. This 6 to the 500, and everything else it projects linearly. So let's create one of those scales right now, and let's see. Okay, back in VS Code, let's create this scale for our x-axis. So again, let's assign this to a variable. Let's call it xScale to keep it simple. So D3.scale linear, as we mentioned. And to define the domain, we just type .domain, and we can follow it up with a range. And for our domain, I kind of figured this out beforehand, but you can sort of sort this ascending or descending. It looks like all our data is between 4 and 8. So I just went ahead and gave it a list. 4 is the min and 8 is the max. And for the range, I did the same thing. But for the range, remember, this is what we're projecting to. So that would be the width of our SVG. So it would be 0 and width. But because I want to leave a little bit of padding on each end, what I did was I did 10% of the width and 90% of the width. So we have a little bit of room. Let's do the same thing for the y-axis or the y-scale. So there is something special about how the y-axis works in D3. The thing is on the, let's jump back to the notes tab. In D3, let me draw another picture here. The origin, 0, 0, is actually the top left corner of your screen. So on your screen, or the SVG, sorry, this is 0, 0. So the y-axis would increase going this way. So when we define our domain or range, we actually need to flip one of them so it actually lines up the way we want it, where the origin is in the bottom left. So let's just keep the domain the way it is. Again, I just looked at the data and saw everything was between, looked like 1 and 5. So just type that in here. And for the range, so instead of having these values, I just need to reverse them. So it's the way we want it to be. And yeah, so now we have our scales. And with these scales, we can now create the axes and plot our data on that. Okay, so let's first create the x-axis. Let's create another variable called x-axis. And to create a horizontal one, we can do x or D3 axis bottom. And the way we define the min and max and where to orient the axis is using the x scale that we just created. So we just do dot scale x scale. So this doesn't actually attach the axis to our SVG yet. To do that, we need to call svg.append, and let's create a group element. So that's defined with a G, and let's give it a class name so we can call it more easily later. Let's call it x-axis. And so now that the group is attached, we can select it using the tag, so G, as well as the class name, so x-axis. And after that, we need to actually transform the x-axis as well, because it starts centered at 0, 0, when we want to move it down here to the bottom. So the way we do that is there's an attribute called transform, and we can give it the value of translate to move it vertically or horizontally. And in this case, we want to keep the x the same, but we want to move it down the y-axis. So let's move it down 90% of the height. That way we leave some room for our label later. Okay, and to actually create the axis, we just need to call the x-axis now. And that should create our axis. And you can see we have it here 4 to 8. Okay, so let's do the same thing now for the y-axis. So again, I'm just going to actually copy this code down because it's mostly the same thing. We just need to change a few of these. So instead of axis bottom, we want it on the left, and we use the y scale instead of x scale. Change the class to y-axis, and this time we don't need to translate it on the x-axis, or sorry, translate it vertically. We need to translate it horizontally. So what we want to do is we want to move it a bit to the left to create some room for the label. So let's move it 10% to the left, and for the vertical translate, we don't need to move it at all. And then lastly, call the y-axis. Okay, let's check if that worked. And great, so we have our axes set up. I'm gonna skip to step 2 actually and plot the data first, and we can create the labels in the last step. Okay, so what we want to do is call another select statement, but this time we want to select all. And we're going to select circle elements. So this might be kind of confusing right now because when you look at our chart, there are no circles. So what really is the select all statement selecting? So right now when you call the select, it actually selects no circles. But this statement, we can actually add the circles in using this by calling dot data. So oops. We want to call the iris data we defined earlier. So what we want to do is call iris data. And in D3, the next step is joining the data to the circles. So we would type join. And I'm going to go more into join in a later video, but just for the sake of keeping it simple this video, what you want to do is define the enter attribute of this function. And what we do is append a circle to each of the rows in our data. So this is where we actually make the circles. And for our circles, we really only need to define a few attributes. So the radius, r, let's just say 4. We want to define where it's plotted, so like the x and y coordinates. For circle, it's cx, and then for the y, it would be cy. Okay, so the way we extract the x and y values is we need to type d, or it could really be any variable, but that's just referring to one row in our data. And we want to get the attribute sepal.length. And remember, because the data is in centimeters and not the pixels on our screen, we need to call our scale function, so xScale. Let's just input the length into our X scale. And then we do the same thing for Y, except we use Y scale and sepal width. Okay. If we take a look here, we can see all our data is now plotted. So that's great. And yeah, so last thing we can do is add color to our data. So for circles, that's the fill attribute. Again, we want to access one row in our data. And for this, we need to define a color scale. So it's much like the X scale and Y scale, but just mapping to color. So let's add one up here. Let's call it color scale. And in D3, the scale we'll be using would be ordinal because we're not working with continuous color. Ordinal means it's discrete. So D3 has built-in color maps, so we can use one of the default ones like this one, D3 scheme category 10. And going back down here, all we need to do is call the color scale, and let's see, it's called variety. So just type D variety, and that should, oh, sorry, syntax error. Oh yeah, no semicolon, sorry about that. Yeah, so now we have the colors added to our plot. And the last thing we're going to do in this video is create labels. So this isn't as complicated as the plotting the data. All we really need to do here is create a text element. So let's create our X label. And what we want to do is append a text element. Let's give it a class again, just so we can access it easier later. X label. And now we select it by the class. So dot X label. And we can give it some attributes to add the actual text. So we could anchor it. Let's anchor it in the middle, so it's centered. We need to define the X, the Y, and the actual text. The X-axis was sepal length, so let's just call it that. Okay, and then, oh sorry, we need a not attribute, this is dot text. And then for X, let's just say the width divided by 2, so right in the center. And then Y, remembering that in D3, 0 is at the top and 500 in our case is at the bottom. We would need to give it the height for it to be at the bottom, and let's just multiply it by this value so it's not all the way at the bottom. And let's make sure that worked. So nice, there it is. And same thing for the Y. It's pretty much the same thing. Let's just call it Y label. Change these to Y. So in this case, our X, this is a bit confusing, but it's actually negative height, and this would be changed to width. And the reason is because we need to rotate it. So again, calling transform, and we want to rotate instead of translating negative 90, because I'll draw it out. Remember that all elements are generated at 0, 0, but we want our text for the Y to look like this. So what we need to do is rotate it down here. And in order for it to still be the right position, we need to give it a value of negative height too, so it's up here when it rotates down. Yeah, so let's change that to width, and I think that should be it. Oh, sorry. What do we mess up here? Oh, didn't close the parentheses. Yeah, so we have to make sure to close that. Okay, that's on the wrong side. Let me see what happened here. Oh, sorry. Didn't change this also. We want it to be on the left side, not on the right side. So yeah, there we go. So here's our complete graph. Let me know if you have any questions. As always, just leave a comment down below. And thanks for watching. In my next video, I'll be going over how to make a bar plot. All right, thanks for watching.